Today, I will be attempting to finish a completely new Rimworld challenge brought to us by the Odyssey DLC. With the addition of Rimworld Odyssey and the proper Vacsuit gear, we can now send our colonists in the cold vacuum of space in hopes to gain many valuable resources that aren't available on Earth. But what if I sent a colonist to space without any space helmet or any spacesuit at all? And better yet, what if I trapped them on an asteroid where they were forced to live out the rest of their lives in complete isolation from the rest of the world? In order to achieve such a feat, we need to create a colonist who was born to withstand the cold darkness of space, and his name was Star Maggot Jim. Star Maggot Jim was of the Star Jack xenotype. These colonists are meant to thrive in space, as they are 45% more vacuum resistant and work better in zero gravity conditions. Star Maggot Jim had a great memory, preferred to be indoors, and he always got where he needed to be very quickly. However, Star Maggot Jim had one fatal flaw. He was way too damn gullible. So when a random waster in a dark alley approached Jim and asked him if he'd like to live out his wildest dreams by becoming the first person in the world to explore space, Jim's eyes lit up. He took this as an opportunity to prove to his mother that he was truly better than his older and more successful brother, Star Maggot Larry. So, as instructed, Jim began emptying all the valuable things that he had on him. This included his wallet, his keys, and his social security card. Now that everything of value representing Jim's life was now taken, he was first blindfolded and then he was shoved into a transport pod and sent on an asteroid in the vacuum of space. He had no identity, no value, and most importantly, Jim had no oxygen. He had about 30 seconds to live before he died from lack of air in the vacuum of space. But Jim had studied space from the day he was born, and although he was gullible, he was a survivor. He noticed a tree that seemed to spread fertile soil to this overall barren land, and immediately his brain went into overdrive. An Archean tree, he said to himself, but in space, no one could really hear him, so it kinda just sounded like this. It seemed like this asteroid had previous inhabitants who had left behind ancient mining charges. But Jim still thought he was on a mission as the first person to explore space, so he just assumed they were a bunch of alien devices left behind. Jim then spotted steel, and his mind went into overdrive. He planted the alien-like devices near some steel and immediately started hitting it in a panic to get it to work. As soon as he did, a fuse began to light, and as the bomb began to detonate, Jim ran for his life. And luckily enough, he was able to get out of range of the blast. Just as Jim did, steel erupted from within the walls. Jim gathered as much steel as he could and took it over to the Archean tree. At this point, Jim was suffering from mild vacuum exposure. At 35%, he experienced pain and was even losing consciousness. But at 85%, Jim would immediately die if he couldn't get oxygen in time. Assuming that what he read about space was true, if he confined himself in a room with this Archean tree, it should prevent him from dying by supplying him oxygen. The race was on. 41% vacuum exposure, 10% pain, negative 20% consciousness. Jim was in a space race for his very own life. But just in time, he built a roof over his head and surrounded himself in a room with the Tree of Life. For the first time since Jim had been launched on this expedition, he could finally breathe, and he already felt as if his mother and brother would be so proud of him. But now that Jim is able to breathe and think clearly, he realized there are many more challenges to come. The first being, there is no food in space. But thankfully, when Jim gave away his valuable resources to the nice men earlier, he absolutely refused to tell them about his hidden stash of Snickers bars that he keeps hidden underneath his armpits. Jim had exactly 10 Snickers bars before he would starve to death and die from the lack of food resources. For context, you can live about 1 day per Snickers bar without starving. If Jim wanted to create a source of food on this barren asteroid, he'd have to do so through the means of the very thing supplying him oxygen, the Archean tree. See, the Archean tree spread fertile soil all around it. But in order to grow food, we'd first need a source of heat, a source of light, and most importantly, a source of power. Thankfully, the vacuum of space contained some of the most rare materials known in Rimworld, and building these are normally extremely easy. But there was one huge issue. Jim was in the vacuum of space and couldn't leave his airlock for more than 30 seconds before suffocating to death. That's when Jim scanned the area around him and noticed several more alien mining charges left behind. Jim had a plan, but even more importantly, he had hope. Immediately he got to work. Several times he completed the dangerous yet extremely effective task of placing mining charges near steel, waiting for them to blow up, and then hauling back the resources before he suffocated to death. Once he had enough steel, he began to expand out of the small little airlock he had created. In an ode to his loving mother, Star Maggot Tabitha, he created a heart so he would always feel trapped by her love. Then a second airlock to stop the vacuum of space from polluting his precious tree of life. Not long after, he gained enough steel to create a bed, which could even be considered a work of art. It was named Death with Loneliness. Engraved on the bed was a representation of how Jim saw himself, a lone gorilla fighting against the 6 saws of death as everything fades to black. After venturing out more, Jim discovered a plethora of compacted machinery. This was an extremely important resource as it would allow Jim to create the technology he would need to grow food on this asteroid. After repeating his explosion trick on the material, it was starting to seem like all hope was not lost. As Jim hauled the materials back to base, he thought to himself, the first thing I'm going to do when I get back to base is create solar panels for electricity. But Jim has one of the most crippling disabilities known to man, really bad ADHD. So instead of making the solar panel first, he got distracted and decided to play horseshoes for a bit. He also got a little cramped, so decided to completely change up this room scenery by expanding it out a little bit. Once Jim's recreational needs were fueled, he began work on the solar panels, and once his solar panels were built, he constructed a heater. It was currently negative 103 degrees in Jim's room. That's minus 75 degrees Celsius for you Englandoids. So Jim was pretty ecstatic about not nearly freezing to death every night before bed. However, Jim had more pressing matters to worry about. He only had 5 Snickers bars left, and he hadn't even started growing crops for once he ran out of food. With the heater keeping his room at a comfortable 30 degrees and the second solar panel in the making, it was time for Jim to take on his biggest project yet, turning his bed into a grow room by creating the first greenhouse in space. After searching through some boxes left behind by the asteroid aliens, Jim found 2 more archery and tree seeds. These plants were tough and very effective, and by planting one of these in his dwellings, it grew almost immediately and started producing oxygen. Once this tree was placed, Jim felt security as he now had 2 sources of oxygen in case the first one were to get blighted or not provide enough oxygen in the first place. He also planned to make a research bench in the second room once his bedroom had been converted into a grow room. But as his food supplies dwindled, Jim started to become more and more hopeless. With Jim only having 3 Snickers bars left, he prayed that when the sun rose, his plan would come into effect if he had enough power, heat, and light to grow the food, or else he wouldn't be alive much longer. And then the sun rose with over 3,000 watts of electricity being pumped into Jim's home. The plan for sustenance came to life. The heaters cranked on, blowing out a crisp, dry air that heated the room like a warm summer day. His lamp sprung on, shining as bright as the sun itself. The Archean trees provided the very oxygen that was needed to grow life on this once barren land. Jim got to work immediately. He planted as many rice crops as possible, all scattered across the floor. He knew one day these small seedlings of life would be the only reason he's alive. But as Jim finished sowing the seeds, he realized he had nothing to do while the rice grew. It might take days or even weeks to grow. And as the rice grew, Jim began to grow more and more restless. Meditating at the Archean tree did nothing for him. Throwing horseshoes started to become a feeling of dread in his daily routine. Jim wanted more. No, Jim needed more of a fulfilling story of his life. I mean, he's the first man in space after all. Jim's legacy needed to go out with a bang. However, Jim's plan of blowing up mining charges to collect steel is no longer as feasible as it was before. At this point, there were almost no mining charges left on the map, so Jim took it upon himself to start mining nearby compacted steel near his base. He would hold his breath, run out to mine as much as he could, and come back in gasping for air. He repeated this process several times, and it took a very long time, but Jim had nothing better to do, so he really didn't mind. Soon, Jim mined enough steel to create his very own study room. There, he began researching batteries. By doing so, he could store his excess electricity to power his heater and sun lamp even after the sun went down. However, it wasn't long before Jim ate his very last Snickers bar. On that day, a slew of panic began to slowly creep up on Jim. If the rice didn't grow in time, Jim would starve and die on this asteroid. He wondered if anyone would even hear about the great things he was doing, or if his brother Larry would just turn off the television when he showed up on the news. But Jim had no time to think about such thoughts. He busied himself with the research of batteries. Day and night, he studied the intricacies of the sweet metallic treat that lights up your tongue. And after almost 2 days of studying, Jim had crafted his very own battery and placed it right next to the solar panel. Although Jim was satisfied with his achievement, it felt like it didn't even matter. Jim had gone a whole 2 days without consuming food, and the malnutrition was starting to set in. He was extremely hungry and even started losing consciousness from the lack of food. He sat and waited for what felt like an eternity, starving, staring at the walls, searching for some form of happiness in this dark, lone world. But not too soon after, his first bit of rice grew. Jim had successfully created life on this barren asteroid and was now able to sustain himself with food, electricity, and heating. After nearly starving to death and now having a somewhat steady supply of food, Jim could think of nothing but to get the hell off of this asteroid. He needs to tell his friends and family about everything he's accomplished, creating electricity, building the first space farm. Jim had so much to talk about. As he ventured across the map looking for a way out, he noticed a strange rocket-looking thing, and it looked like it was in great condition. But it was very shiny, so Jim scrapped it for resources. But then he came across another strange alien-looking technology, but it was blue, and Jim hated the color blue. So instead of scrapping it, he just brought it back home to check it out. And when Jim did, he felt as if every prayer of his had finally been heard. It was a grav ship engine. Alone, it did absolutely nothing. But by building a thruster, a command console, and fueling it, Jim could escape this hellhole and return home to his homeland. So immediately, Jim got to work. In order to pilot this ship, he'd need to research biofuel refining and basic grav tech to get it off the ground. Jim had spent the next 5 days doing nothing but eating, sleeping, researching, and mining in his spare time. He was hell-bent on getting out of here as quickly as possible. He spent his days taking advantage of the light to research, and his nights holding his breath to gather as much steel as possible to make the thruster and the other materials needed for the grav ship. When Jim researched everything he needed to get off the asteroid, he deconstructed his research bench and used its resources to create a biofuel refinery. Here he could convert the food that he used to fuel his body into fuel for his spaceship to get off the asteroid. Once he created the refinery, all he needed to do was farm enough steel to create a thruster and a chem fuel tank. There were several close calls where Jim almost died in the vacuum of space trying to mine the necessary materials to get off this planet. But each close call let him know that he was actively winning a fight where the entire planet was against him. As Jim mined for all the materials he needed, his crippling ADHD began to set in once more, and each test felt so monotonous. But it was like the gods had answered his prayers, because soon he received a radio comm to receive a readable map to fulfill his entertainment as long as he stored tox waste packs at freezing temperatures. Because space is always at a negative 100 degrees or less, it was a no-brainer for him to accept this quest. Jim spent his spare time reading about ancient soldiers that guarded a vault back home, and thought to himself, maybe if he returned home one day, he'd explore it with his brother Larry. Jim knew he could soon get off this planet once the rice was grown, but that might take days or even weeks to happen, and who knows what the vacuum of space might throw at him. However, someone was clearly on Jim's side, as packs of blood rained from the sky in cargo pods. They were absolutely disgusting, but much more filling than rice. Jim indulged on the blood packs, but woke up with a new determination and hope in his soul. He created the pilot's console and then the chem fuel tank. Soon, Jim would have a fully functional ship ready to leave this asteroid. And on the 8th of December, Jim rose to the smell of freshly grown rice and knew that today was the day. After scrapping down his beautiful artwork of a bed, the sun lamp, and his heater, he used the spare steel resources to create the final and most important item to launch out of space, the fuel thruster. As Jim had spare materials, he crafted one more tile of storage to bring something valuable with him home, the Archean tree. The Archean tree was the only thing that kept him alive in space, and he never wanted to forget it. Although he couldn't replant its seeds, he chopped down the wood and packed it into the spaceship so he could show and tell his mother Tabitha and his brother Larry about the amazing adventure in space that he had. And soon, after filling up the ship with over 50 chem fuel, Jim mounted the pilot's console. Jim didn't actually know how to use a pilot's console at all, but he watched Star Wars, so he figured it couldn't be too hard. But it turns out, piloting a ship is much harder than Jim thought, and instead of ending up back home, he ended up on an active volcano. But Jim didn't really care. He finally got to touch grass, he frolicked around the ashen fields and felt the warm air against his lungs. And that night, he even slept in a mound of ash to show his appreciation for the Earth. And soon, the same waster that sent Jim to space approached his spaceship. He wasn't sure how he found him, but he was so excited to share his stories with the waster and let him know everything he achieved. But as the waster approached Jim, he looked at him confused and said, "How the hell are you alive?" Jim explained how he built a ship and only made it out alive because of a crazy space tree and almost starved to death. And the waster said, wait a minute. You built a spaceship?" Jim replied, "Yeah, it's right there." The waster asked if he could borrow Jim's thruster and promised he would bring it back after a few hours of studying it. Now at this point, you might think Jim would have learned his lesson, but as I said earlier, Jim is very gullible. Jim replied, "Of course you can. Just make sure to bring it back. I have to tell my mother and brother about all the amazing things I've done." So the waster grabbed Jim's thruster and ran off into the distance with his only means to escape the active volcano. And once again, Jim was stranded on an extremely dangerous terrain all alone. But you know, Jim was happy. He had become the first person to go to space. He'd probably made his brother jealous and his mother proud. And honestly, Jim was just happy not to be in space anymore, despite that being his childhood dream. Jim was satisfied with what he had. But sadly, no one has heard of Jim's amazing achievements. But it's up to us to make sure that Jim's story doesn't end here. Make sure to like and comment underneath the video to spread the word of Star Maggot Jim's space adventure to the entire world. That way, Jim can become famous, and by doing so, make his dirtbag brother Larry jealous of him, and his mother Tabitha proud. So, thank you guys for watching, and thank you Jim for your perseverance. With that being said, I love you guys, and I'll see you in the next one.